You really believe that? Look, what you are doing is arguing long and loudly against the way life is.
Nothing changed the West faster than the railroad. In the late 1800s, an anvil chorus echoed across the plains. Civilization steamed over everything in its way, including the Indian. But the spirit of the untamed land still lives in the West of the imagination.
Tonight at 10 here on Northwest Public Television.
You're watching Northwest Public Television, KWSU Pullman, and KTNW Richland, Pasco, and Kennewick.
Good evening, and welcome to Counterpoint for Thursday, February 11th. This is the program that brings together a couple of people you know. Bill Hall, the editorial page editor for the Lewiston Morning Tribune and columnist with that newspaper, who generally represents the liberal point of view. And on the conservative side, Doug Wilson, a Moscow minister and also a columnist for the Lewiston Morning Tribune. And I'm Glenn Johnson. We'll go to the grab bag of current topics in just a few minutes. But first of all, here's an opinion piece by Doug Wilson.
The way I see it, liberals have got to stop helping Pat Robertson. The only way Mr. Robertson is going to get anywhere in the Republican Party is through an appeal to that party's conservatives. He has so far been far more successful in this than pundits anticipated. So what do the liberals do about this? They protest in the shrillest possible tones those positions of Mr. Robertson that most movement conservatives share. An example of this would be the heat Pat Robertson took for mentioning the racist origins of Planned Parenthood. The liberal response was typical. All indignation and no refutation. Here, Pat Robertson knew what he was talking about. Conservatives need not support Pat Robertson. I do not. But it baffles me why liberals are trying to increase his conservative support. The Republican Party is conservative. Pat Robertson, therefore, wants to assume the mantle of Ronald Reagan. When he is attacked by the liberal establishment because of his mainstream conservative positions, he is only helped, and that by liberals. Liberals really ought to change their tactics. But that would involve some homework and research on the real meaning of conservatism. And that would interfere with our prejudices, wouldn't it, Bill?
Well, I don't think I can ever be accused of having accused the Reverend of being a mainstream conservative. But I understand your point. Candidates do tend to get more attention if they're a little bit more in left or right field. And he does a better job at serving as a lightning rod for the press in that respect than anybody I've ever seen.
No, that's not my point. The point is not that he attracts lightning from the press. The point is he attracts lightning from the press for those positions which are really mainstream conservative positions. They're not objectionable to conservatives at all. There are some things that he could be taken to task for which he has not been taken to task for, and the things that he gets it for are things that you have conservatives out there scratching their heads saying, well, why is everybody excited about that?
I've never considered praying for the end of a hurricane a mainstream conservative position, but he is kind of a clever little Dickens when it comes to finding ways to get the attention of the press through attack or otherwise, and that's part of what the presidential game is about, is to stand out in the crowd. But sometimes I think he stands out a little bit more than even he would like.
No, when you're talking about him, let's say, healing the lady in the yellow Volkswagen on an old 700 Club thing, that's the sort of thing that strikes some people as erratic. Right? Why, is this really a man we want to have running for president or occupying that office? But when he says that Planned Parenthood was racist in its origin, and your paper attacks that as a wacko position, he's in the know and your paper was not.
It's not only a wacko position, but it's unfair. Every one of Margaret Sanger's age, Abraham Lincoln was a racist by present definition, but to charge that today's...
Margaret Sanger could have been a speechwriter for Adolf.
Yes, and so could George Washington. But to dredge up ancient history and rub the nose of a respectable, serious, multiracial organization today is a dirty trick. You know, we could do the same thing with his Baptist church.
Wait a second.
Am I getting more like him all the time?
The problem is this.
I can't say Baptist church without doing a slight
That's
imitation
Baptist
of
has
Robertson.
has a P in it. No, it's not Baptist. It's Baptist. Anyway, the point is, if you take, let's say you attack Planned Parenthood for its racist origin, if a contemporary
How about for its racist, current racist views?
Wait a second. If a spokesman for Planned Parenthood said, yes, Margaret Sanger had some fruitcake views about race, and she was a racist, and yes, she was the founder of Planned Parenthood, Pat Robertson got that exactly right, but we don't stand for that anymore, everybody would say, well, what's Pat Robertson talking about this for? But when they huff and puff and say that's not true, and everybody knows that it was true, it is true, then it looks like they've got something to hide.
But he says he is against Planned Parenthood because of ancient history. That's not true. He's against Planned Parenthood because of what it believes today. Well, he disagrees with it on abortion, and this other stuff is just mudslinging.
Well, there are plenty.
There
are plenty of things to disagree with in Planned Parenthood, both ancient and modern. The modern objections, you could rename it Planned Parenthood or Banned Parenthood, whatever you want.
I was interested to see that he did indicate he supports some forms of birth control.
Oh, Bill, it's time now for your commentary.
I have a warning for America. If we don't make condoms available to the wicked young folk on our nation's campuses, then they will know that they will get AIDS, pregnant, or both. Consequently, nearly all of the wicked young folk will mend their ways and start staying out of each other's shorts. And the few who don't will die or have babies, which is a just punishment in both cases for their unsuitable behavior. Similarly, if we take flak jackets, helmets, and armored vehicles away from armies, nearly all of them will lose the appetite for war. And if we outlaw seat belts, drivers will be forced to stop speeding. After all, a seat belt is just a substitute for the kind of ethical behavior that drivers should be practicing. And if you permit seat belts, you will be encouraging people to delude themselves that they are safe doing the sort of thing they shouldn't be doing. Oh, sure, some apologists for immorality behind the wheel will try to tell you that people are going to speed anyway, so you might as well let the little dickens have their seat belts. But after all, how effective are seat belts anyway? A seat belt is merely a Band-Aid on a gaping moral wound in a society that needs instead to come to grips with the ethical failure of risking your own life and that of others by traveling at morally repugnant rates of speed. And to say, as some do, that speeding is just another lifestyle is akin to saying that homosexuality is just another way to get a date on a Saturday night. Let's do away with condoms, with armored vehicles, with seat belts, and we will surely do away with illicit sex, with war, and with speeding as well. And remember, he who drives too fast to a sexual encounter that causes a war is truly an abomination. Doug?
Speaking of abominations, that piece was a logical monstrosity. Do you really mean to tell me that because it is illegitimate to take preventative measures for an illegitimate activity, it is therefore illegitimate to take preventative safety measures for a legitimate activity?
Speeding is not a legitimate
Right, wrong, these are strange concepts.
Speeding is not a legitimate activity.
Is driving a legitimate activity?
Yes, driving.
Could you ever use a seatbelt and be in need of a seatbelt without ever breaking the law?
Could you ever be in need of a seatbelt
without? Suppose the other fellow's breaking the law. Suppose you lose control, but you weren't speeding. Suppose any number of things. The seatbelt is a preventative safety device not designed to subsidize the breaking of the law. It's simply designed to protect people's lives in a legitimate activity.
Similarly,
driving.
In marriage, condoms have a legitimate purpose.
So who's talking about condoms in marriage? We're not. We're talking about condoms on university campuses. We're talking about pushing condoms for the unmarried, for people who are engaging in immoral, illegitimate activity, and you're trying to lump the two together. Right? Wrong? These are strange words.
We're talking about using a device that permits people, in some cases, to commit illicit acts such as speeding and fooling around outside of wedlock.
We're not talking about making condoms legal.
Well, I don't know what you're talking about. That's what I'm talking about.
We're not talking about making them legal or illegal. The debate that's going on in our society right now has nothing to do with whether they ought to be lawful or legal. It has to do with whether university administrations ought to push them on young people, subsidizing this sort of behavior. It's like New York City's decision to start giving clean needles to drug addicts. What they're doing is subsidizing an illegitimate activity.
Well, of course, my whole brilliant point here again today is that you are a fool if you think that taking condoms or seatbelts away from people are going to regulate their behavior in any large measure. You are a fool if you think that people aren't going to kill themselves without seatbelts and without condoms.
Do you honestly think that the fear of AIDS has not caused people to modify their behavior?
Yes, and I think the fear of death on the highways has caused people to modify their behavior.
What's your problem?
But there are exceptions to that, and I don't believe in the death penalty for disagreeing with Doug Wilson.
It's not the death penalty administered by Doug Wilson. It's simply the recognition that the way this world operates, there are consequences for certain types of behavior. If you jump off of cliffs, you get hurt. If you sodomize someone else, you get hurt, they get hurt. And that hurt might be death.
Yeah, well, that might make you feel righteous, but it bothers me. I think that people who disagree with me shouldn't die for it. I mean, your holier-than-thou view of how people should behave sexually and behind the wheel of a car.
There are two problems here. One is whether we ought to be pushing condoms, and the other thing is whether they even work in the first place in the prevention of AIDS, and if so, to what extent are they efficacious? What extent do they work? We don't know that either. What's happening is some old die-hard sexual revolutionaries don't want to give up their libertinism, and consequently they're grabbing at anything that will enable them to keep going for a few more years.
More people will die without seatbelts and condoms than with them. I think we ought to keep them around, even if the consequences, someone enjoys the sexual company of someone else.
Excuse me, that has been established with seatbelts, and seatbelts are a protection in a legitimate activity. It has not been scientifically established with condoms. We don't know to what extent they're efficacious. We don't know
to what extent they are. We know that they are. We don't know to what extent entirely seatbelts are effective, but we know that they are.
Does it concern you that terrorists might blow their fingers off making homemade bombs in the basement? Why don't we give them the materials and federally printed subsidized pamphlets on how to make bombs? That way they won't hurt themselves.
Well, making bombs and making love are to you almost the same sort of illicit conduct, but to me one is a bit lovelier than the other.
I'm reminded of an old line by Ronald Reagan where he says, back in the 60s, I saw some kids carrying a sign that says, "Make love, not war." He said it didn't look like they were capable of doing either.
Time now to go to the grab bag of current topics. And, of course, the Iowa caucus is one of the big stories and what's coming up for New Hampshire. Let's start with the Republicans' bill, and, of course, Doug, join in. I'm sure you will.
No problem.
Who's been eliminated? We have some names that are no longer going to be heard from again. And did you see any surprises?
Well, the big surprise for a lot of people, I suppose, was Pat Robertson, but not so much in a caucus state as if he does the same thing again in a primary state. A caucus is really kind of, it's easier for a minority to stand out in a state where you're not going to get as many people out to participate as you will in a primary. You'll have a higher participation in the electorate. If you've got, say, 25,000 voters for you, 25,000 of 100,000 is more impressive than 25,000 of 500,000. He does have his die-hard, fervent supporters, and he can get every supporter out that he has. We'll see how well he does on that in New Hampshire.
The really interesting thing on the Republican side is what happens when we consider who's been eliminated. I think it's safe to say that DuPont is not going to last past New Hampshire, even though the main conservative newspaper there is supporting him, and that Haig is not going to make it past New Hampshire, which leaves us with Dole and Bush on the more moderate wing of the party and Robertson and Kemp on the conservative wing of the party. And I think it's safe to say that Bush was badly wounded in Iowa, and if he does not do as well as expected in New Hampshire, then I think he's going to be in serious trouble, which will leave Dole against the conservatives. And since Robertson is not really nominatable, he's not going to head the Republican Party ticket no matter what happens. That means that Bush supporters are going to have somewhere to go, and I think that will be to Kemp. So I think it's going to boil down to a Dole-Kemp race with Robertson in the role of a broker, making deals.
You really think that Robertson cannot get the nomination? Like they used to say about Jimmy Carter, there's no way he could do it.
I agree with the assessment that he has a large number of fervent followers, but he has a super high negative rating.
And Jesse Jackson have a lot in common on that, too.
Right. He's a high negative rating, and it's not just from, he's got one kind of negative rating from the secular humanists, like Bill over here. He's got another kind of negative rating from conservative evangelicals who are suspicious of the charismatic stuff. So he's got large hurdles to overcome. I don't think he can do it, but I think he can arrive at the convention with money left over and a lot of delegates and be in a position to bargain.
I really expect Dole to win New Hampshire. He wasn't expected to do that, and as recently as last weekend, I think there was a poll showing Dole 6 or 8 points behind Bush. But Bush now has a real credibility problem, finishing third. And he had all the money. He had the largest pocket full of money. He had the biggest war chest. He had the best organization. He is the sitting vice president of the United States, and all he could do was third up against...
and he was running in Iowa for 9 years, or whatever that was.
And so he's got real credibility problems. People who are thinking of voting for him in New Hampshire are going to have doubts now. At the same time, Dole, let's not get so sidetracked by Robertson that we don't notice that Dole finished far ahead of Robertson. He was way up there.
How much
so
is
he's
the
going to
neighbor...
ride in with a lot of credibility into New Hampshire. I think it's going to eat up that 6 or 8 point difference real fast.
How much is the neighbor factor? I'm from Kansas and voting me in.
Well, I'm sure that's a factor, but it doesn't matter. Win is win, and if it works as I say it will, it doesn't matter how he did it. But if he did it with Mears, he still has the ability now, I think, to win New Hampshire. Once he does that, he has spread all over the news magazine covers and all over the networks, and at this stage, it's really a name familiarity game, and it's a momentum game. And Dole could come out of New Hampshire with a lot of momentum, and Robertson's kind of the big story right now out of Iowa. But if Dole takes New Hampshire back-to-back and defeats Bush in the process, and especially if Robertson doesn't do quite so well, then Dole becomes the big story, and big story is often big votes.
Well, we gave Bill a shot, the liberal at the Republicans. Will give the conservative a shot at the Democrats. Doug, how do you think the Democrats did in that particular race? Any surprises there?
Well, no, I don't think there were any... Well, the one surprise was how well Paul Simon did. It astounds me that someone who cannot speak and cannot excite people apparently excited a number of people and got them out in a caucus state to vote for him. So him coming in second did surprise me. But it was close enough to be virtually a three-way tie between Gephardt, Simon, and Dukakis. It was also surprising how many votes Jesse Jackson got in Iowa. He got about 10% more than he got there last time, which was remarkable. I think we can say goodbye to Babbitt, and I think we can say goodbye to Hart.
Hart was some vindication of something, I think. As recently as a couple weeks ago, there were polls showing Hart still with 20-25% in both Iowa and New Hampshire. And that was some illusion, obviously. The guy just vanished from the scene.
Well, that's a whole another subject that I'd like to encourage people to watch carefully the polls that precede an election and the actual results of an election. It baffles me why people continue to give credence to polls and pollsters.
Well, it doesn't act, as a matter of fact, if you check polls over the past 30, 40 years, you'll find that they're pretty accurate about 90% of the time. But this is one of the most volatile elections ever, one of the most difficult for the pollsters to forecast, simply because that undecided vote remains so large. Simply because it's been such an unappealing field. People haven't gone strongly to this candidate or that, on the Democratic side especially, and that makes it very hard to call. And so people who are hanging in there saying, well, I've been with Gary Hart and I have my doubts, I don't see anybody I like better. Pretty soon they like somebody better. When the chips are down, they make the decision and they don't like Hart. Well, so polling should not be discounted. It is quite accurate most of the time, and it's just like being a weatherman. When you're wrong, everybody notices, and when you're right, nobody notices. Pollsters are pretty good at their job.
That's probably too close to call, so let's go for the next question here. Bill, we'll start with this one. Reagan's request of $36 million to aid the Contras. Is this a wise and economical decision when looking at the deficit?
Well, I don't think it has anything to do with the deficit. It's either a wise idea from a foreign policy standpoint, from the interest of the United States, or it is not. And of course, I don't think that it is. I think it's a futile idea. I think Congress has finally had it, and which means the American people have had it with that. They want to get out of that weird section of the world and come home and mind their own business for a change.
I would like to just walk away from this defeat that he suffered in Congress on the contra vote with one thing, and that is when the Sandinistas back out of the peace process, when they wreck it and say, okay, now the Contras are defunded, let's continue doing what we want to do, I would like to see the president and other national conservatives be willing to show some gumption and hang this vote around the liberal Democrats' neck and say, you cut off the Contras, then you're going to have to defend that, given how things are going in Central America. Look what happened just in the last few days in Panama. Noriega gets indicted for this drug smuggling, and what does he do? He says, I want U.S. Troops out of Panama. That is a volatile region, and if the Sandinistas are allowed to consolidate the revolution, if the Contras are eliminated entirely, it is just a matter of time before things start coming up towards us. And I would like the liberals to be willing to say, yeah, I voted against the Contras in 5 years, as they are willing to say that they did now.
Well, I would agree with you if the Contras were truly freedom fighters along the line of our own forebears in the American Revolution, as the president claims. But instead, they are even worse than Daniel Ortega. They are no friends of freedom. These are throwbacks to the old National Guard that used to run that country in the former police state. This is a contest between two police states.
I'll put it to you this way. First, that's not true. Adolfo Calero is not a lot of the Contras were part of the original revolution against Somoza. That's
Some of them are, yeah, and I'll admit it's a mixed bag, but
secondly, even if I grant your point and say that they're all Somocistas, even if that were granted, if they were in power, we have leverage with them. We have no leverage with the Sandinistas.
We have leverage, but we have no morals, and Noriega proves that. And we're down there trying to make friends with one of the biggest thugs in the universe.
No, we're not trying to. He was just indicted for crime.
Well, I know. He finally got to be too dirty for our hand, even for our hand.
No. Wait a second. Noriega is a good example of what I'm saying here. If someone gets out of line, someone who's supposed to be a friend of ours, and he gets out of line, we have some leverage with him. We do with Noriega, and it's currently being used. We don't have any with Ortega. If the Contras were in power, even assuming that what you're saying about them is true, which I don't accept, but even assuming that, we would have leverage with them.
Yeah, the good little obedient dictators versus the wicked dictators who were beholden to the commies in the Soviet Union. I like Jimmy Carter's foreign policy. Don't fall out of your chair. Where he believed we should stop playing these games, playing one dictator off against another, come home, run America, stop trying to run other people's affairs, and let them get stuck with whatever kind of dictator they had.
And what happened to us?
Good dictator, bad
and what
dictator.
happened to us on Jimmy Carter's watch?
Well, I don't know what did happen to us on Jimmy Carter's watch.
Well, we lost Iran, for starters. Does that sound like good foreign policy for you?
We did have that nice, obedient Shah in there before.
But you'd rather have...
See, the Shah produced the Ayatollah. Don't you? You people don't understand that.
No, Jimmy Carter produced the Ayatollah.
You ride along with somebody like the Shah who makes enemies of his own people and makes enemies for us with his own people. We did the same thing in Cuba. We sent Vice President Richard Nixon down to Cuba to pin a medal on Batista. Batista's police had killed a higher percentage of the Cuban people than we lost of our population in World War II. And we wonder why the Cubans turned toward the Soviets after the revolution, why they don't like us. We support some creep like the Shah, and we wonder why they turn to some other creep like the Ayatollah. We've got to stop backing creeps of either kind. And
the issue is not whether we have not used leverage on our creeps in the past, in the way we should.
Who elected us to use leverage anyway? That's not, what's this white man's burden? I don't understand.
It has nothing to do with white man's burden. It has to do with us watching out for the foreign policy interests of the United States. One of the ways we can do that is we should have used more...
One of the ways we can do that is to support dictators, to hell with the freedom of other people.
No, what we should have done is we should have kept the Shah in power and leaned on him to...
Kept the Shah in power. See, you betray this whole line. We keep this person, we topple that person. Who elected us to do this?
You mean it should be a matter of indifference to us?
Who elected us puppet master of the world?
Do you have that view toward Mexico, for example?
Yes, I certainly do.
It doesn't matter to you?
We have no right to manipulate. It matters a hell of a lot to me what goes on in Mexico, but it's less likely to turn out wicked if we stop playing Big Uncle Sam and treating them like little brown people. If we treat them like equals and neighbors, they're less likely to end up with a regime hostile toward it. I couldn't even respect a Mexican who wasn't mad at the United States. any more than I could respect a resident of Idaho who wasn't mad at Washington for the way the Big Daddy in Washington treats these little states. But
I must admit, you lost me on that transition. But
well, I'm from Idaho. I'm used to being treated like a surf state by Washington and by Wall Street. We are.
So you think that if we're good neighbors and we treat everybody nice, then we can be good friends and there'll be no problems?
I think
sort of like Jimmy Carter treated the Sandinistas when they first came into power. And what they do? We gave them all sorts of foreign aid under Carter. We helped them out. And what they do? Straight to Moscow. That's because they're Marxist-Leninists. They are advocating a revolution in Central America. It's going to march up toward Mexico. And when it happens in Mexico, you will realize that what goes on in other countries does have a bearing on the security of the United States. And that is the business of the United States.
They turned to the Soviet Union primarily because they refused to accept Jimmy Carter's outstretched hand, because the only hand they'd ever known from the United States was the one that was in their pockets and the one that was crushing their democratic impulses. We made enemies of an entire country. That's why we did it in Iran, we did it in Cuba, we did it in Nicaragua.
Talk to me about so they
we're doing it in South Africa.
So they turned to the premier totalitarian government on the face on this globe because they have democratic impulses. Give me a break.
No, not because they had no, I didn't say it's because they had democratic impulses. I said it was because we treated them like little brown people, manipulating them all their lives. 70-year-old people remember the United States and the United Fruit Company running their lives, running their country with no divine right to do so. Nobody elected us to do that. They've hated us for years, and I don't blame them.
Let's break that topic and go to something else here. Playboy recently placed an advertisement in a local paper. I said we'd be changing the topic big time. This caused an outrage by readers. They felt that papers should not advertise any type of pornographic material whatsoever. In a capitalistic society and free press, where should the news media draw the line on advertisements, Doug?
Well, the news media should draw the line wherever their own standards are in terms of advertising. I would say, of course, you shouldn't give any support at all to pornographic meat wagons like Playboy, Penthouse. If you do that, you're simply underwriting the subjugation and the degradation of women. And I don't think any responsible publisher ought to do that. I have a real problem with advertisers, businesses, and responsible mainstream groups that lend legitimacy to pornographic magazines like these.
Well, it's really a tough situation for a publisher of where to draw the line. Obviously, there's certain ads that you can't run, but you can understand that newspaper people, of all people, are very reluctant to get involved in anything that smacks of any kind of censorship, especially by us. And I think maybe the best standard you can follow is some things are blatantly over the boundary, especially for a family newspaper. But when in doubt, you print it. If it's not blatantly something that shouldn't be in, if you have some doubts, you print it. There's even some legal questions involved. The Tribune was one time threatened with a lawsuit because in a classified ad, it was darn certain involved the house of prostitution. We decided to leave it out, and we found we were going to have to prove it was, in fact, the house of prostitution to leave it out. They were offering sex therapy lessons, something like that.
Bill, this one's for you. On January 25th, exclusive interview with George Bush and Dan Rather brought on a lot of talk, a lot of opinions. Was Rather out of line when he handled the interview in his way, or do you think he handled the interview correctly?
No, I thought at a couple points he went a little bit overboard. He was acting more like an editorial writer than a newsman. He was getting far too argumentative. However, I think he was used. I think George Bush decided to pull a Spiro Agnew and run against the press and run against Dan Rather, and went on and tried to provoke a fight. He uttered several facts that I had forgotten about how many minutes Dan Rather was off the set during that famous blackout. And he had these all memorized. He obviously went on there trying to provoke a fight.
This is the difficulty. I think Dan Rather ought to be let go, but not for all the usual reasons. I agree with you that Bush was gunning for him, and it was a setup, not by Rather, but a setup by the Bush people to make it look like Rather was gunning for him. The difficulty is this: Rather is supposed to be a newsman, and he allowed himself to be suckered into that. And I don't think someone in that position ought to fall for something like that. If, let's say, Bush came out and wanted to run against the press and tried to do the same thing with Ted Koppel, it wouldn't have worked. Ted Koppel would have just deflected the question and remained calm, cool, and collected. the strategy would have backfired. It worked with Rather because of Rather's liberal knee-jerk tendencies. He rose to the bait. He showed the whole world that he was not a journalist. He was...
Welcome to Counterpoint for Thursday, April 14th. This is the program that brings together a couple of people you know. Bill Hall, the editorial page editor for the Lewiston Morning Tribune and columnist with that newspaper, who generally represents the liberal point of view. And on the conservative side, Doug Wilson, a Moscow minister and also a columnist with the Lewiston Morning Tribune. And I'm Glenn Johnson. We'll start off with an opinion piece, and then we'll go to the grab bag of current topics. First of all, here's Bill Hall.
I've got a bone to pick with some of you people out there who are my age and older. Maybe our generation of college students should pay its own student loans before lecturing the students of this generation on paying their student loans. During my generation in college, the student loans were merely implied, but the debt was plainly understood by any honorable person. The transaction was what it had always been in the land of open education. You accept your higher education from the older taxpayers, and then, when you are out of college and situated, you pass it on. You accept the level of taxation necessary to provide an education for the next generation. That was the student loan of my years in college, a loan we now neglect to repay. Ours is a generation of welchers. We go out of our way to elect politicians who will protect us from the debt we owe for our schooling. When the bill comes due on our student loans, our politicians protect us from the taxes required to keep the bargain. Instead, our politicians heap higher and higher tuition on the young. Now that we've got our education, to hell with the next generation. Not only is that unjust, but it is also detrimental to the nation's well-being in the years to come. As tuition escalates and the grants and the loans are pinched back even more, fewer and fewer of the current generation will be able to afford academic and vocational training past high school, and that will surely blight our future as a people. That is why my generation and its short-sighted politicians are doing this to our country. And what a sorry lot we are. We ignore a debt of honor, and then we have the gall to point the finger at members of the next generation for being slow to repay their loans, loans that never would have been necessary if my generation had been faithful to its own obligations. Doug?
Bill, I'm not even going to ask you where you discovered this implied contract that was made years and years ago. I'm going to ask you, rather, what you're going to do with the welder in some small rural community who is graduated from high school, if that, and is paying higher and higher taxes so some medical doctor's son can have lower tuition rates.
Well, first of all,
is that your idea of justice?
Yes, it is, because first of all, there's no such thing as a welder who won't need retraining several times in life, either to become something else or to become a different kind of welder. Welding will not remain the same now and forevermore, unlike your political thoughts.
That's right, change the subject. I would too if I were you.
No, that's not true. There's no such thing as a person who doesn't need some education now and then throughout life. There might be a few weird ministers and a few deadbeats on the streets, but other than that, everyone needs education past high school these days. But even if they don't, even if they don't, some of us pay to help others along, and the doctors and the newspaper people pay to build a street past the welder's house.
And your scheme is to have the middle class and the lower middle class pay higher and higher taxes. My question is, the people that are going to school are going to be higher wage earners in the future. My question is, why can't they finance their own education? That seems to be the equitable way. You pay your own way.
Well, first of all, I'm sure it's easier to bat down the arguments I haven't made than the ones I have. I favor taxing those who can't afford it hardly at all, those in the middle like me quite a bit, and in addition to what you didn't mention and seem to think I would exclude, I would tax the wealthy very much. As we are blessed in this society, so should we tithe. But we need to do this the way we've always done. Why this break? When I went to college, I got this idea from going to college virtually for free, because the generation before me, having earned the means through public schooling for the most part to earn a good living, paid a tax on that living, and gave me a free education. It was my only chance. I came from the wrong side of the tracks. Now that I'm making a good living and can afford to pay, let me pay now, and let's not mortgage the future for these young people starting out in life.
Does education cost the same amount that it used to? Or is it costing a lot more because there's a lot more administration and bureaucracy tied up with it? Because it's tax money and not money that is operating in a free market.
It costs more and we make a lot more. All I know is I can better afford to pay the taxes to put young people through school today than my generation of uncles and grandfathers could.
I don't have the figures for higher education, but I think the same thing is happening there is happening in primary and secondary education, and that is between 1959 and 60, when it costs a little over $1,000 a year to put a student through school, as opposed to a few years ago when it cost over $4,000 to put them through school, and that's in constant dollars, adjusted for inflation. You figure that it costs 3 or 4 times as much. The test scores are going down. The number of administrators is going up. The point that you're making ultimately is that we want to keep on piling the taxes on to lower middle-class people, so that they can subsidize an incompetent system of education.
If it does indeed cost more, and I suspect to some extent it does, so be it. There's nothing more important to the well-being of this country than education.
I
want to accept your premise.
If education is so important, then it ought to be important enough not to squander money on.
Well, that's what I was going to say. You wouldn't let me interrupt. You interrupted me interrupting, and let me go ahead and say, agree with you on administration. We are top-heavy with administration. I would not only lay some of them off, but I would take them out and have them shot, because they've been wrecking education even more than you right-wingers trying to
And what would you do with
to suck the lifeblood out of
And
education.
what would you then do with all the accusations, the shrill accusations from the liberal left, saying that Bill Hall was the enemy of education because he was firing administrators?
I tell them the same thing I tell you. You can take it and stuff it. I say what I believe, and I don't care whether anybody likes it or not.
Doug, it's your turn now.
The situation in Central America is frankly intolerable. Our nation is divided in 2 camps, those who believe it is intolerable now, and those who will believe it is intolerable 5 years from now. Those who believe it is intolerable now want to do something about it now, obviously. Those who will come to their senses in 5 years will no doubt want to do something about it then. But what can they do? The communists in Nicaragua remain in position. The Contras have been taken out of action by a short-sighted Congress and a weakened president. In a very short time, we will see the revolution exported to other Central American countries. Within 5 years, the communist expansion will be enough of a threat that even a liberal Democrat will be able to see it. But what will we do then? Any president, liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat, will be forced to use American troops to meet the threat. Why? The answer is the moral blindness and political cowardice of the 100th Congress. I hope someone will remember at that time where the responsibility lies. Bill, do you think you will?
I swear, Doug, sometimes I'm with you. I think I've gone through a time warp. What year is this, 1950 or so?
Yeah, this is 88.
You and some of the other cuckoos up here on the Palouse on the left are never going to learn that the driving force in the world today is not communism versus capitalism, that old comic book nonsense of you anti-commies and the Ortega lovers up here on the Palouse. The driving force in the world today is nationalism. That's what drives Ortega, and that doesn't make him, it certainly doesn't make him a saint or a friend of democracy, but it may make him more popular with his people than we are and than our puppets, the Contras, your so-called freedom fighters.
So how does that change the situation in Central America? So let's say the socialists now are nationalistic, which makes them like the Nazis were, socialist and nationalistic, as opposed to international. It isn't any less of a threat. What are we going to do about it in 5 years?
I frankly do not lie awake in terror at night, fearing the invasion of Daniel Ortega and his hordes.
That's the problem.
I'll be honest. I think what it means is the Nicaraguans in the future will be running Nicaragua, not the Soviet Union, not the United States.
And who's going to be running Guatemala?
The Afghanistanis will be, the Guatemalans will eventually be
what kind of Guatemalans?
That's my point. You get hung up on whether it's communist or whatever. They're nationalists. There are puppets in this world of us and them, and you know who them are. But for the most part, it is nationalist in these countries. They want to be left alone.
Is Castro a nationalist?
He is primarily a nationalist, yes.
Primarily?
He is less
he's not interested in exporting the revolution elsewhere in Central America?
I think he is less interested in exporting the...
But is he interested at all? Are any arms being shipped?
Are we interested at all in exporting our isms around the world? Why don't we all just stay home and mind our own business?
Do you believe that we ought to mind our own business with Mr. Noriega?
With Noriega? Yes, in a manner of speaking.
You know, what do you mean in a manner of speaking, yes or no?
Well, what I mean is, it is tempting to go down there and knock him off, but on the second thought, what right do we have? That's not our country. Why don't we just get out of there and leave him alone
And let him run drugs, right?
No, we will fight him at our own borders, but we can't go down there and throw people out. If we're going to throw out if we have this God-given right, the policeman to the world, to go throw out everybody who is disagreeable with us, everyone who does us harm, we will take over the world and run it. But
Okay.
you're not going to be happy
Now,
until we do that.
So
You know, Margaret Thatcher
I'm
gets
glad-
a little liberal once in a while. We ought to do something about
I'm
her.
glad that you were consistent with Panama, so we can then go on to South Africa. Do you think we ought to interfere in the internal policies of South Africa? Or do you think we ought to quit being the moral busybodies and
I
policemen of
think
the
what
world?
we ought to do in South Africa is what we're doing, just
We're minding our own business?
ending our contacts with them, yes.
Well, so should we end our contacts with
Including financial, my friend.
Should we end our contacts with Nicaragua, Panama?
Yes, as in terms of meddling in their affairs.
Now, wait a second.
If they want to come be nice to us.
Wait a second. We can't end our economic contacts with Panama without toppling their government.
We can meet people in the United Nations on a business-like basis, but we don't have to go throw our arms around dictators around the world.
Okay, now, what are you saying? Do we interfere with other governments' internal policies or not?
We react to Nicaragua and Panama the same way we react to Canada.
And we recognize no difference between Canada and Nicaragua and Cuba?
Oh, I certainly do, but I don't recognize our right to play God of the world and decide what government other peoples will have.
So if the South Africans want to do their thing to the blacks, then that's okay with you?
No, that's not okay with me, but I don't think we have the right to go in there with the American army and settle the matter.
Okay, do we have the right to go in with American economic pressure and settle it in South Africa?
No, we have the right to leave with our American money because we don't want it dirty. We don't want anything more to do with them.
Okay, so we have the right. So we also have the right to boycott Nicaragua and boycott other communist states. So you wouldn't object to an American boycott of Nicaragua?
If they were doing, no. I mean,
You wouldn't object to that?
generalize a little bit, I wouldn't know.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to see that you're coming around, Bill.
That'll be the day.
Time now to go to the grab bag of current topics. And one of the topics we've been opening up this show for the last couple of months is all about the presidential primary. Now it's April 19th, and the state is New York. And some experts say 255 delegates are up for stake, and that could be it for the Democrats. And will this take care of Jesse Jackson? We'll start out with Doug Wilson here.
Well, it seems to me that it's a question of whose Dukakis gets gored. You know, if Gore does well at all, and goes into the double digits, then he is going to take away, not from Jackson's support, but from Dukakis' support. Dukakis is going after the Jewish vote, which is a quarter of the Democratic vote in New York. Jesse Jackson's got the black vote sewn up. If Gore does well, then he could ensure a Jackson victory, which is kind of ironic because Jackson's the one that Gore's been going after.
I've been surprised too often this year, that's another way of saying wrong, to go way out on a limb and say what's certainly going to happen, as I have so many times and so foolishly this year. But what it really looks like is going to happen to me is that Dukakis is going to get the lion's share of the New York vote. Gore is going to continue to stumble. And that may indeed, this big state, give Dukakis the momentum. He finally needs to polish off Jackson in the final stage. Ordinarily, he wouldn't go into the convention with enough votes, but he would have the kind of momentum that people who are hanging loose would say, he's going to get it, let's get with him before we go to the convention. That's the way it usually works.
Well, the problem is if Jackson were stopped dead in his tracks right now and didn't win anything after this, he's already formidable enough at the convention to dictate platform terms and possibly even a position on the ticket right now. And when you consider that he's certainly going to go all the way to the convention in all the subsequent primaries, he's going to do well simply on the strength of the black vote alone. I don't think you can write Jackson off at all. Of course, it kind of thrills me that he might be on the ticket, because if that happens, then the Republicans might get the House back and will almost certainly get the Senate back.
Well, let's say that he goes into that convention the way it looks now, with Dukakis, the certain nominee, and unstoppable by Jackson. But if he gets no more votes, delegate votes than he has right now, he will have the means to dictate a lot in that convention. But I think one thing Jesse Jackson will not be dumb enough to want to dictate is a defeat for the Democratic Party. He has to be like your friend Robertson, looking 4 years down the line a little bit now.
He was looking 4 years down the line 4 years ago in '84. He is smart enough to understand that, but he also has a big enough ego to require something else. I think he's got too much on the line. I think he wants it now.
He's got enough delegates in his sack now to get himself Secretary of Education or something like that. But if you see him try to really dictate something crazy, it will mean he considers this his last shot. And those people are too vain. Political careers are made over a lifetime. Presidential chances are made over a lifetime. Consider how long Winston Churchill ran for the top office in his country.
So you don't see a Dukakis-Jackson ticket?
I think that's unlikely.
You think that's an electable ticket?
Well, according to one poll, a CNN poll, it is. Whether it happens or not, I think depends on whether Jackson continues to kind of hang in there. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Dukakis kills Jackson in New York, and then a month down the line, Jackson kills Dukakis in Oregon or someplace like that. It's that kind of year.
Bob Dole, any surprise pulling out?
No, I think after New Hampshire, it was just a matter of time. His campaign had a great opportunity, which they dropped.
I'll tell you what I think killed Bob Dole. The word leaked out, apparently the accurate word, that he is really nasty to the hired help, that behind the scenes, this jovial, funny man is not that funny, that he's abusive to help, and every time something goes wrong, he blames it all on the help and gets new help. He's always firing people off with their heads. He's kind of a crab behind the scenes, and Newsweek and several others printed that, and I think that turned a lot of people against him. I know it lowered my opinion of him. I always had a rather high opinion of him. I don't now.
Okay, Bill, here's a question. Secretary of State Schultz is in the process of peace talks between Israeli and Arab leaders. The fighting and killing continues. Just a few days ago, a teenage girl was stoned to death. What impact will Schultz really have in trying to mediate the peace talks between those two countries?
I don't think he's going to get anywhere because apparently the Arab leaders aren't ready to recognize Israel yet. And until they're really ready to get pragmatic about that, it's just going to go on and on and on. And not only that, but Schultz is a short timer. If he were going to get anywhere, I think he would have by now. I think a Hussein or somebody like that would have broken and gone with him. He has failed in that so far, and if he didn't do it by now, he's unlikely to 2 weeks from now.
The situation in the Middle East now is like the situation in Northern Ireland. That is, it's a no-win situation. Every direction you turn, there are insurmountable problems. What it boils down to is, and this really upsets modern Americans who have come to believe the political illusion, and that illusion is there is a political solution for everything. Well, in the Middle East, given the way things are, there is no political solution. Nothing can be done.
I have to say, I was really appalled this last week, not only that some of the Palestinians were involved in attacking some innocent school children, but that sort of thing goes on all the time. But the Israelis, one Jewish child is killed, and all of a sudden, this is the height of the war. There's something like 170 young, nasty Palestinians that have been killed. There's something very racist right now, the reaction of the Israeli government to that incident. And I don't defend the attack on those children, but what's going on over there, people are getting killed, and if it's a Jewish child, it is a thunderclap. If it is a Palestinian, it's just one of those crazy kids and they deserved it.
What you have is a situation where if each side wants to point fingers, there's plenty to point at. The Israelis have a lot that is reprehensible with the PLO and the terrorists and the Palestinian movement. There's a lot to point at, and the Palestinians also have a lot to point at, as we've seen on the network news. The same thing again in Northern Ireland. If you're looking for dirt on the other team, there's plenty of dirt to go around. And I don't think an American Secretary of State can come in and say, let's sit down. There is no political solution given the framework that we have in the Middle East now. There has to, something has to change there, or some outside force has to come in.
Doug, here's a question for you. With prison space limited, judges are devising new ways to punish criminals, such as victim restitution and community service jobs or court-mandated schooling and job placement. We've even seen some of that in Whitman County take place. Are these alternatives too lenient? Are we going too far?
No, not at all. I think that the penitentiary system and the prison system is one of the most ridiculous systems ever devised by the mind of man. And the way the question is put indicate, you know, here we're going to something new, victim restitution. Well, that is centuries old. We are returning to something that makes a lot of sense. What happens now is if someone steals something of mine, a car, and then goes and wrecks it, and they catch the guy, what happens? Well, we send him up the river to the penitentiary, and then I pay higher taxes to pay his room and board. Well, that makes no sense. If we're dealing with nonviolent crimes, there should be no prison time at all. Or if there's any kind of prison time at all, it ought to be a prison factory, and the sentence ought to go like this. The car you stole cost X amount. You go work in this factory. As soon as you pay it off, part of your salary goes to pay your room and board. Part of your salary goes to pay the victim off. As soon as the victim is paid off plus 20%, you go free. So restitution should be the only thing we require in nonviolent crimes. In violent crimes, particularly some people might have to be locked up for the public safety, but if it's particularly violent, then I believe the solution is capital punishment.
Well, I agree with you on this this factory approach and paying off the debt. For another reason as well, people are better off, the prisoners are better off doing something than sitting around on idle time. But I'll tell you what's one flaw in your argument, and it's not your fault for once. Every time you try to set up something that makes sense like that, the people in competition with that auto factory, your free enterprises will come roaring forward and saying, what is the government doing competing with us? It's happened. The Idaho State Penitentiary tried to build office furniture. Maybe they still are. And all the other people around, commercial people building office furniture, were up in arms about it. And I can't quite blame them, but we've got to do something. We've got to find some line of work for these people to keep idle hands occupied and to teach them a trade and to let them pay off their debt.
Well, yeah, the issue is mostly finding something to do that the state has already undertaken. And the prisoner has an incentive to work hard because the harder he works, the sooner he's out. And if restitution is made and it's a nonviolent crime, the victim is paid back rather than the victim being penalized to pay for the...
Let me tell you about another way to empty these jails out a little bit faster. We got a letter to the editor the other day from an occupant of the Nez Perce County Jail, and if he's telling the truth, I have no reason to doubt him. He is in there for driving without auto insurance and being caught at it and not being able to afford the fine, and he's serving out the fine at $5 a day. Now, that's really not realistic. I don't know what your time is worth in jail. I'd pay $50 a day to put you there myself. But if you let these people serve out their fines at some reasonable rate of time, instead of $5 a day, we'll get them out of there faster.
Mm-hmm. Not only that, Chuck Colson, who is working actively in prison reform, has pointed out that when he was in prison as a result of the Watergate thing, here he was, a high-powered attorney, and he and this former high muckety-muck in the American Medical Association were both in prison. I don't know what this other guy was in prison for, but what they did, they took turns running the washing machine. And Colson said, that's ridiculous. You've got an attorney, you've got a doctor, you can supply community service that is valued at a certain amount, and then when it's paid off, you go free. But the restitution should be made to the victim, not to the state.
I agree with you, and because of that, I'm going to go to that doctor and have my head examined.
Since we're sort of on that topic, and drugs get into this, how would you handle a drug? You've mentioned restitution to a victim. How would you handle the drug dealers or the drug users in that particular prison situation?
The drug dealers and the drug users, well, the whole question of drugs is a grievous one. There's no way that we can clamp down on a crime as widespread as illegal drug use. That problem will only be solved when the demand goes down. That will be the only thing that will solve the problem. In the meantime, for drug dealers, people peddling hard drugs, not the people in possession of marijuana, a few ounces of marijuana, but someone running cocaine, there ought to be really stiff penalties.
I'm not a presidential candidate, so I don't really have any answers to this problem. The obvious answer is the one the First Lady mentions, and that's if all the Americans stop using drugs, there won't be any market, at least in the American market. But that's not as simple as it sounds either. You're saying to addicts, don't be addicted, and they are. I'm not running for president, so I'll tell you, I don't know.
the halfway houses and all the different substitutes they've used. It doesn't seem to work. And they've had raids, and they've taken, you know, pounds of cocaine. That doesn't seem to work. We've made raids, and that doesn't seem.
Well, it all goes back to what I said earlier. We have bought into the political illusion. We think there's a political solution for everything. I would like to see one presidential candidate get up and say, well, frankly, I don't think that is any of the government's business, and even if it were the government's business, the government doesn't know what to do about it.
This trying to deal with the drug at the source, though, the Reagan administration is doing, as the Attorney General specifically, is utter nonsense. I did hear, though, the Attorney General on his tour of some of the dope fields of South America becoming a little more realistic on it. He saw the magnitude of the problem of trying to go out there and pull 30 people out of 500 square miles of jungle. It's not quite as simple as he thought.
Well, since you've mentioned the Attorney General, Edward Meese, let's do a Meese question.
Well, let's do.
Several of his staff members have quit. His name is being dragged through the mud. Should Reagan ask him to resign or give him a chance to prove himself?
Well, Reagan, it's remarkable to me what a good friend Reagan is to Ed Meese. I just wish Ed Meese would be a good enough friend to Ronald Reagan to take him off the hook on this and do what he recognizes he has to. Doug wrote something on the Jimmy Swaggart case that when a minister screws up, it's not quite the same as other people. He has to get out of that racket. A doctor or lawyer who steals doesn't get to become a lawyer again. And I don't say that Ed Meese has stolen, but appearances are more important in that job than in a lot of others.
But look at this. First, I agree that Ed Meese ought to step down. But part of the reason...
Why? I don't understand.
Yeah, well, part of the reason he isn't, and the left is to blame for this, is they've been...
I knew it.
We knew we had to ask. Basics.
Yes. Ed Meese is the fault of the left.
They're to blame for this because they have spent a good portion of the Reagan administration running people out of office for political reasons. Richard Allen was run out over a pair of cufflinks or a wristwatch or something. And frankly, the liberal left, when they scream scandal or when they scream the sleaze factor, I have trouble believing them anymore. It's like the boy who cries wolf. If people can be forced to quit simply because the liberals accuse them of being corrupt, then they can get rid of anybody they want conveniently. That is the power to tar and feather somebody in the media is a potent weapon, and the left has been far too careless in the use of it.
I agree that the media and/or the left, I think we're merging them there.
Well, they're synonyms.
Yeah, sometimes has difficulty telling the difference between a cufflink and highway robbery.
And also the difference between a conviction and an accusation.
But presumably the President of the United States should not have as much difficulty as he's had telling the difference. He should ignore the liberals when they're wrong, pay attention to them when they're right. And the fact is, when you believe they're right, he doesn't even pay attention.
Ed Meese is under fire now for some things that I believe are legitimate questions. But he has been under fire for years and years for all sorts of illegitimate reasons, simply political. And the problem is, from northern Idaho, it's hard to tell the difference. Are these people really indignant at the scandal, or are they indignant at something else?
Top law enforcement officer, top coordinator, and that's still in it.
No, but the problem is, how do we get to the point where a conservative president can get elected and appoint genuinely conservative people to high office without having somebody accuse them of corruption for political reasons?
You can't, and you can't do it with liberals either. It is the nature of the press beast. It is the nature of...
You're watching Northwest Public Television, KWS.